1, 2, 3, swing it.
Have an old sound tape or your favorite cassette tape that you want converted to CD or MP3 format? Do you need a demo CD, radio ad, a DJ or even a sound system for your wedding, birthday or a special occasion? Then why not get in contact with KTR Records on 07931 152 448 or check out our website on www.ktrrecords.com. We have been in business since 2004 and also undertake community projects. So for your remixes, dublets and all your sound editing needs, why not contact KTR Records, official sponsor of World Jam Global Radio. KTR Records, coming your way!
I was terrified about sharing the vulnerabilities of people with difficulties reading and spelling words. However, I could see the value in sharing, and I have taken the time to make some notes about this in my book, Dyslexic: The Silent Difference. You can get your copy now at www.a1tribe.com or amazon.com or amazon.co.uk. Thank you again everyone for your support.
Do you like music like this?
Great music all the time.
Or like this?
The music you love.
Maybe this.
Great music that makes you want to turn up the volume loud.
Or life chat like this.
Especially where human life is concerned. Surely, sooner or later, people will realize that lives actually matter.
Then you're in the right place. Keep it locked to World Jam Global, where music is harmony.
Music 24 hours a day, 365 days a year.
Yeah, I'm a World Jam. Hotter than them.
See live schedule.
Already did my time. I paid for my crime.
Hang tight, we're going live for another Issues Today on World Jam Global Radio. Alongside your host, Kervin, Julien, your guest speakers, Yolanda McNair, Jerry Summers, Patrick Lane, Scott Rushin.
Already did my time.
Have I missed anybody? Don't worry, I'll be back in a very short while. Enjoy the music.
I paid for my crime. Already did my time. I paid for my crime. Back in the day, I didn't really care about the system. It was all about survival. It was do or die.
Yep, it's another one of our round table shows. That's where we get a panel of professionals, some of our very renowned guests.
I was good with my hands.
I'll explain all very shortly. Hang tight. Use this opportunity to share this stream live across the world, please.
Life is so sweet. Now things have changed. The whole game has been rearranged. I'm a changed man. Don't need no gun in my hand. It ain't about being no gangster. Life is too short to spend it all in jail. Trying to cope with this living hell. Already did my time. I paid for my crime. Already did my time. I paid for my crime. Already did my time. I paid for my crime. Already did my time. I paid for my crime. Already did my time. I paid for my crime. I was a drug dealer, sold more drugs than Superfly, but I never got high on my own supply. I'm not proud of what I had to do. That's why I'm telling my story to you and you. I had to repent, I must admit, I was doing all kind of stupid shit. Now I sit back and think it over since I've gotten older. The life I used to live, I wouldn't do it again. I was young and dumb, my brain was so numb. I was a real Forrest Gump, but I was nobody's chump. Me and Billy the Kid had a lot in common. I was the real Terminator, much meaner than Arnold Schwarzenegger. I'd chew you up and spit you out like a real alligator, especially all you haters.
The opening statements are going on right now. He could be facing life in prison.
Already did my time, paid for my crime. Already did my time. Already did my time, paid for my crime. Already did my time. Pay for my crime, pay for my crime, pay for my crime.
Good evening, you and you and you and you and you and everybody else.
So I can get my life on track and have the
Good evening, Michael Hudson, Lorraine Thompson.
Again, this is my message.
Genevieve Huzia.
The pen, statewide, worldwide. There was not a man I couldn't beat. I was good with my hands.
You're in tune to Issues Today on World Jam Global Radio, live, streaming across the world. With your host, Kervin Julien, our producer and co-helper, TJ Teresa Gallagher can't be with us today.
It ain't about.
But we are joined by our guest, Yolanda McNair, co-founder of Post Protect Our Stolen Treasures. We also have with us
Pay for my crime.
Jerry Summers, former Chief of Police of Idaho.
I paid for my crime.
And an author.
Already did my time. I paid for my crime.
We also have with us Mr. Scott Russian,
did my
father,
I paid for my crime.
activist, Patrick Lane, uncle, activist, both public speakers, and both able to share something really powerful.
I was a drug
today's show.
More drugs than Superfly, but I never got high on my own supply. I'm not proud of what I had to do. That's why I'm telling my story to you and you.
Alright, it's another round table.
I was doing all kind of stupid shit. Now sit back.
And it's the fight against police brutality.
The life I used to live, I wouldn't do it again. I was young and dumb, my brain was so numb. I was a real Forrest Gump, but I was nobody's chump.
Now, I had the fortune, pleasure, privilege and honor
I'd shoot you up and spit you out like a real
of hosting some shows this past month.
Already did my time.
And two of them in particular took my fancy. And we're going to be reviewing them with our panel today.
Did my time.
As we look at as we review the mental health policing policies and practices and approaches. And hope to get a better handle, understanding of what people have to go through. And maybe see what influence and impact and change we can make in order to give you an understanding of what your rights might be, should be.
Trying to cope with this living hell.
So that maybe you can see what some of these families have lived through, living in, going through, as they handle the loss of their loved ones.
I want to be thy name, thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation.
And just before we introduce our guests,
for thine is the kingdom.
I've just been featured in a 13 part podcast series on BBC, which you can also find posted on my wall. You can also find on iTunes. It's called Shreds. It was about a massive miscarriage of justice.
It ain't about nothing.
Where 5 innocent men were charged with a murder they didn't commit. 3 of them were convicted and sentenced to life in prison. I was involved in the campaign to help set them free. After 4 years, we were able to get them free.
For track and have the right to.
It was renowned as the most expensive murder trial in British history.
Statewide,
and it was only followed by the most expensive police corruption investigation in UK history, which was able to collapse due to further police corruption. I hear in the grapevine that Netflix and BBC are looking to turn it into a dramatization, but we'll reflect on that very shortly. It's Kervin Julien on Issues Today. It's World Jam Global Radio. Good evening, folks. Okay, without any further ado, we actually have our guests who are all ready, and we have been in the pipeline trying to get our dear friend Scott Russian in, and I do believe he's online now, but I'll speak to him very shortly. But as I was just saying at the beginning of the show, I do want to say a big good evening going out to Tanisha Tanisha Tilson Joseph. We interviewed her a couple of times on the show. We'll have her again. I know we're due to rebook her very shortly, but we were talking about this podcast that I was talking about, because this actually was my my entry into police corruption and miscarriages of justice and that kind of thing. And this happened back in 1988 for me. When I stumbled across, it came up on my TV screens while I sat down at home. And when this news came all over, it was immediately apparent to me that there was some severe miscarriage of justice here, because I knew all the guys that had been charged. And I knew that none of them were friends. They weren't people that hang around with each other, let alone go out and commit a murder together. It was a really extraordinary case, and I advise you, if you can get an opportunity to get onto that podcast, it's called Shreds, SHREDS. It's available on my wall. You'll see it's been a 13-part episode. But that was my introduction into police corruption and miscarriages of justice. Well, it wasn't actually. My introduction was myself. I witnessed police brutality growing up as a kid, so it was something that I faced myself, but it was my first port of call of getting involved in it in an official activist sort of way, so to speak, right? But here I am 4 years later, almost 5 years later now, and I'm still doing Issues Today here on World Jam Global Radio, and every week we've had a different guest with a family member talking about the loss of their loved one. We've done wrongful convictions as well. We've even done anti-terrorist or terrorist claims, and the killing of that young lady, Serena Slin. I've forgotten. Serena Shim, the journalist that was killed out in Turkey for uncovering the truck that was being loaded with weapons on the World Trading Order, World Trade Organization's lorry, bringing it in to the Taliban or whatever. But yeah, we've done all sorts of show, and we've focused a lot on issues that really relate to our basic human rights, our civil rights and our human rights. But the last few years we've been doing this, I can't help but struggle when I come across families who are really striving to get to the truth of how they lose their loved ones, but lack sufficient support and knowledge. Oh, I don't know what's going on here. Somebody's trying to call me on Skype, and they shouldn't be. What's happening here? It's okay, I'll deal with that in a minute. Oh, what's happened here? Have I just cut everybody off? Are you guys there? Right, we've got to do this again. Bear with me. I don't know why people do this, but we'll do it. Where is it? Hey guys, hello.
Yeah, hold tight, guys.
I don't know what happened there, but somebody cut me off. Are you guys there? Hello? Hello?
Hello.
Right, are you everybody there?
Yes.
I don't know how we got cut off, but we got cut off. Right, okay.
Okay.
So we're back anyway.
We got you back.
Okay. So anyhow, as I was saying, and then I had Scott trying to ring me on a separate call. So I don't know what was going on there, Scott. He's got his mic muted at the minute. But have we got everybody? Patrick, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Yolanda, you're there. Jerry, you're there. Scott is there, but he's just on mute at the minute. But hey, there we go. Anyhow, what I was saying was that we have... I struggle when we get different families who come on here and they're trying to get to the truth of the matter of how they lose their loved ones. And they lack so much support and advice. And then we start to unravel the case as we discuss it. And then before you know it, they realize that, well, why didn't your attorney ask that question? And why, So we've decided to bring about this roundtable in the hope that we can start giving people a better understanding of some of the cases that we have on the show, and even some of the cases that are yet to come. So bear with us as we do this, and I'm going to introduce you to our guests one by one before we start on the nitty-gritty. And again, as I said, as a gentleman, it's ladies before gentlemen, so they'll all give you a brief introduction as to who they are and what they do. We shall start with Yolanda McNair. How are we doing, Yolanda?
I'm doing pretty well.
Okay.
My name is Yolanda McNair. I'm the mother of Adacia Miller. My daughter was killed by a Detroit police officer one day before her 25th birthday. All my daughter did was go out to try to celebrate her upcoming birthday. Um, Prosecutor, police department ignored my daughter's death. Treated it as something basically that they stepped in and that they had to wipe off their feet. Unfortunately for them, they got the right one. I'm not that mother. I'm not letting my daughter's death be in vain. I'm not going to let them forget her name. I um, co-founded an organization called Protect Our Stolen Treasures, better known as POST. I'm the president of POST. We have 5 chapters, one in Columbus, Ohio, Greenville, South Carolina, Portland, Oregon, and Lawton, Oklahoma. We have over 5,000 members that are active. We are activists. We fight for those who can't fight for themselves. We fight for those who are tired, sick, have died. We carry that torch for those who cannot. So um, I've been working to get justice and get my daughter's case reopened. Um, they use the crux of police department the city of Detroit going into bankruptcy and close my daughter's case without there ever being a complete investigation or a resolution to how my daughter was shot. So I'm here with these gentlemen to make certain that no one's child, loved one is forgotten or goes without justice.
Amen. We appreciate you so much, Yolanda, as do the majority of women up and down the country and families who have come to know what your support is and have had an opportunity and a blessing to be able to be supported by it. So thank you very much for all the work that you do, and we're going to be coming to you very shortly. Next, I'd like to introduce to you Patrick Lane. How are we doing, Patrick?
I'm doing well, Kervin. Thank you.
It was an honor to share your story. Please introduce yourself for us.
Well, I'm honored to be here with all of you today. My nephew was Taylor Rock. He was killed. Basically, it was a lynching of 2 officers that had conspired to lure him onto a road where he was shot as he sat in his car. And that was on May 31st of 2014. So far, they have released no evidence in this case. Although it's been 5 years, will soon be 5 years. Haven't released the clothes, his phone, and other pertinent pieces of evidence to do with the case. And that's what got me involved with this great movement that all of us are involved in today. It's an honor to be here.
Well, once again, Patrick, I really do thank you. We honor you for first of all sharing your nephew's story with us and being here with us to be able to share your contributions and observations as we continue. Next, I'd like to introduce a dear friend. His name is Scott Russian, who's also the father. But I'll let him tell his story. How are we doing, Scott?
Can you hear me okay?
Absolutely, Scott.
Oh, great. I had a little chance to talk to Yolanda a bit, and we'll be talking again. But for those listeners, I'm not from the law enforcement world. I was ignorant of what's happening, the alarming trends in police, until my son, 34-year-old Tyler Rushing, was shot and killed outside a commercial building in Chico, California, the county of Butte, California. It's the home of Chico State University. My son was there with friends for 4 days, and in summary, he was alleged to be a burglar, and a guard came, confronted my son, shot him through the chest at point blank range, and then my son did go into the building to the bathroom to try to give himself some first aid, and about 45 minutes later, the Chico Police Department broke in, and between the K-9 and 4 officers, my son got, even though he'd been wounded, he got a shot through the throat and a shot through the back of his head, and died at the scene, of course. And This is a young man with no criminal history and no weapons, and there's a lot of mystery, Kervin, and now I'm an advocate for excessive use of lethal force. I'm learning all these stories across the country from these good people and professionals and families, and what concerns me, and we'll talk about it, is the patterns that you see in all of these officer-involved shootings. The scripts that the officers use, and the vilification of the deceased, and the damaging reputation of the parents, and the scripts that law enforcement uses. And so thank you for allowing me and to be part of your team.
Thank you very much, Scott. And we will be hearing a lot more from Scott as the show continues. And finally, our honoured guest, and I have great pleasure in introducing Jerry, and I believe he's a real treasure to us, former Chief of Police of Idaho and an author, a brilliant one at that, Mr. Jerry Summers, and I'll allow him to introduce himself, and we'll get to it very shortly.
Kervin, what an honor to be here again. I am a former chief of police and a strong advocate on transparency within law enforcement and the lack of self-policing with law enforcement. Like Scott said, there is a script and a vilification of parents and victims of police brutality in an effort to justify or get public support on the police action when it comes to unlawful killings of individuals. The problem is the power is within the government, and with it being within the government, the families don't get any information or enough information to respond to the allegations that the prosecuting attorney and the police department are putting out. And once the damage is done, it's very difficult to recoup from that. So I'm a strong advocate on changing the laws for transparency in investigations. After investigation is concluded, then the public should be able to get the findings of that. Obviously, some of it will have to be redacted, personal information, but they should be able to get findings and the investigative background so they can make their own opinion. And because without that kind of transparency, there's no way the citizens can make changes within law enforcement, because and it's obvious that law enforcement is not doing itself. It's not self-policing. It hasn't for the last 50 years, and it's getting worse. It is that.
At the beginning of the show, I talked about these podcasts that I've been involved with, Shreds, about a miscarriage of justice, and I did so for a reason. So before we go into the subject matter that we're going to kind of look at today, I wanted to explain why I went into Shreds. On Thursday was the 13th and final episode of Shreds, which went out on iTunes and on BBC Sounds, and I listened to it Thursday morning. And on the final one, the one before that on 12, it was the collapse of the investigation into the police corruption that led to the wrongful conviction of the guys in the first place, which collapsed because of further police corruption, right, on disclosure, them holding back paperwork that they should have handed over that would create an unfair trial, which caused the judge to squash the convictions and find them all not guilty because they wouldn't be able to get a fair trial. So on episode 13 was just a revisit of the community that had suffered this entire miscarriage of justice, and some of the family members that were left behind picking up the pieces. And I wanted to share this with you guys for you to understand that here's the thing. 2 of the 5 guys that were charged with the murder are no longer alive. They both died at the age of 49 because of the severe depression and all of the impact that all of this stuff had on them, right? Ronnie Actie, for example, began a life of seclusion, isolation, depression. His family had to go around and change his bed sheets. He was a recluse. He was afraid to come out of the house because people thought he was guilty of a horrendous, heinous murder that you know you disown the closest member of your family for, right? But just to be associated with that murder, irrespective of the fact that he was found not guilty, left him in such a state. You could never give him back those years or the time that he had before he was charged with that murder and propelled into public media because of it. Yusuf Abdullah had a huge, massive compensation payout, which led to him continuing to take a whole range of concoction of drugs, etc., until he too himself went into isolation and depression and eventually died. Tony Paris's father died never getting to hear that his son was actually innocent and proven innocent in a court of law. He died. He knew his son was innocent, but he never got to hear it. He never got to see the result of his son being exonerated and found not guilty and set free. He died while his son was still serving life. Now, the impact that some of this corruption and miscarriages of justice and the impact on some of these families who lose their loved ones, who are then recriminalized. No, there's a lot of people who talk about the compensation that people go for. How do you compensate somebody for the things that we've just discussed, for the things that we've just heard about? How do you even try to say, well, it's all right, he got some money, didn't he? The money doesn't matter, and all of them will tell you that. The money doesn't matter. It might help them get through some tough times ahead and all the rest of it, but it doesn't get them back the years that they've lost throughout all of this stuff. Now, I want to just go to Yolanda first, because you lost your beloved daughter the day before her 25th birthday, and she was about to celebrate, and that's what she was doing. She was going out to start an early celebration of that birthday. But Yolanda, how much compensation do you think that they would have to give you in order for you to be satisfied that it was right with you?
There isn't enough compensation. First of all, I'm an eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth kind of person. So unless he's really thinking that trading his life for my daughters is going to compensate me, there's nothing he could do. My daughter did not come here with a toe tag saying how much of a value she would be.
So no amount
There's
of
no compensating it.
There isn't, is there?
Nothing. There's nothing. There's nothing they could do. And I'm even going to go so far as to say he could never be dead enough to make me feel satisfied.
Mm-hmm.
I get that. I totally get that. Let me just move over to Scott Rushing very quickly. What sort of compensation would satisfy you at the loss of your son? What sort of compensation will pacify you and your family members who are left to reminisce?
Right. I, of course, can only agree with Yolanda. There's no dollar amount. My lawsuit against the guard company and the Chico Police Department and the Butte County Sheriff's is, first of all, I'd like to see the two shooters, behind bars. I would like to see them convicted of some type of manslaughter or premeditated crime. I would like to see a change in the culture, particularly within those two departments, and then, of course, worldwide, regarding use of lethal force. I don't need the money. We're not, Jeff Bezos, but we are comfortable. And my wife and I, we had, one son, one daughter, and now we have one daughter. And there's absolutely no compensation available to us. We don't want the money. We want the guys who killed the two men punished, disciplined, out of the business. Well, one's already retired on a force. Well, that's a long story, Kervin, but one's already out of the business for strangling another suspect. 17 days after he shot my son, he was caught strangling a suspect in the back of his police car. And that led him to be retired. But the guard is still active in Chico for the same company that shot my son, gave the initial shot through his chest. But basically, I want him behind bars, to make a long story short. I don't want any money.
I hear that. Patrick, it wasn't
Yes.
your son, it was your nephew. But if you and your
Yes.
family had to try and seek compensation in order for you to be able to, for it to sit well with you? What sort of compensation would pacify you?
I echo what the two previous participants stated, is that there's no compensation that is enough. This is every day we live with a gaping hole that's been ripped in our family, and what my sister and I tell each other is that, and realize fully, is that there's no way that we can be made whole again. There's no way that Scott can be made whole again, or Yolanda can be made whole again. But what is important is, when I hear of stories like what happened to Scott's son and what happened to Yolanda's daughter, all of these children, because they are someone's children, become that. I think that's why so many of us, Scott, Yolanda included, once this happens, the most obvious and reasonable gravitation is to be an advocate against what we have realized is going on. There's no compensation that can make up for Taylor's loss.
Absolutely. We've got a lot of noise in the background here. I don't know who that is at the minute. But I am trying to bring Dee Martin, Andre Gladden's sister, onto the show.
I'm here.
Okay. Thank you, Dee. We're going to be with you very shortly. Just stand by. There's a reason why I've called you in. But there is a lot of noise in the background, and I need to try and ascertain who that is. And if you know who that is, can we find a way of muting it or doing something with it so that we can actually really get across the message that I'm trying to get today? Before I go to Dee, Jerry, are you there, my friend?
I am indeed. I'm sorry, I was muted.
That's fine, Jerry. So there you have it. We've been asking the family members what sort of compensation. And the reason I say, guys, mute your phones, turn off your sounds, put on no notifications, do not disturb. But these buzzing sounds are going to keep coming through unless you manage your smartphones. And it's quite loud because I've got headphones on, so I'll hear it even louder than you do. All right. Please. So here's the thing. I'll go back to Shreds because I listened to the last and final episode on Thursday, and Tony Paris said it himself. He was one of those that was given compensation, and he said no amount of compensation will bring his dad back. None. No amount of compensation can repay him for not being able to look his father in the eye and say, I'm a free man. There's the proof I didn't do it. John Actie lost his mother and his brother as well in all of this. And I mean, you can actually hear him cry on the podcast as he thinks about that loss and the support that's now gone. When people think that, okay, so you've lost your loved one, you've had a miscarriage of justice, the state's now going to compensate you financially. Why is it that some people think that compensation is enough?
That's an interesting question. They're not looking at the loss. There is no like everybody has said, there is no compensation that can replace a loved one. The only type of thing that I think would even give any solace to family members who've lost a loved one wrongfully would be the criminal prosecution and conviction of the individuals who killed their loved one. And just because they're wearing a badge does not protect them of that if it's a clearly an unlawful killing. And I apologize for the noise in the background. I have some construction going on. I'm going to try to minimize that.
Okay. You can be forgiven, Jerry.
Thank you. The other thing, though, is I see that one of the things Scott Rushing said, which was very poignant to me, was that one of the officers that killed his son, Tyler, is out of the business because he was caught strangling somebody in the back of a police car, and he was allowed to retire. In circumstances like that, I don't believe officers be able to retire and get their retirement. I think they should be convicted. If they're convicted of a felony, which that would be in that instance, they should forego their retirement. I'm sorry. If you spent 20 years working at law enforcement and you do something that obscene, you should lose your retirement and the privileges of that. That would help in getting some restitution to the family, but it's never going to resolve the loss of the loved one.
At the very minimum is gross misconduct, and if you was dismissed on a gross misconduct charge at work, you wouldn't expect to get anything, right?
That's correct, but it's not gross misconduct, it's criminal.
No. I get all of that, because majority of us at work wouldn't get criminal. Majority of us at work, the highest degree of dismissal would be gross misconduct, right? But
correct.
The point I'm trying to make is, once you get to that level and above, you should be losing all benefits connected to that job.
Agreed.
At the very least.
Agreed.
Okay.
And that, I want to be a little careful in that I would want it to be not a questionable situation. And the problem with me saying that is law enforcement does not investigate themselves well. So everything they're going to say is a questionable circumstance, and the officer was justified in doing that. That's their script that Scott had talked about earlier. That's wrong.
You know the funny thing? When it came to investigating the police force that was responsible for the case that I was on about on Shreds, everybody was touting for an outside force to come and investigate. And they were adamant that they wanted to investigate it themselves because they wanted to prove that they can get some form of confidence back in South Wales Police. And they screwed that up. The bottom line is some very important documents went missing. And then in order for them to justify the dismissal of the case, they claimed that the chief prosecutor had told them to shred it. It then turns up 2 weeks after the trial was dismissed that the documents were there in the box where they had always been. Nobody bothered to look. But it was a deliberate attempt to sabotage the case. So when they gave in and allowed the local law enforcement to investigate their own, they ended up with the same result. No confidence. I don't get it. But
well, and claiming that somebody told them to do it is irrelevant, because ethics in the law are ethics in the law.
Absolutely.
Citizens have to follow it. So should the police.
The biggest question I had to ask was, why wasn't the chief prosecutor called in into the box to confirm that he'd actually asked them to shred it, and why? Never was. He then goes on record as saying he never told anybody to shred it. It shouldn't have been shredded. Then where did it needed to be shredded come from? That's a totally different case. All I'm trying to say here is I agree with you. When a law enforcement office is investigated by its own, it's very unlikely to ever to come up with anything objective. Now, I want to move quickly on, because the reason why we're having this round table today is we want to look at the mental health related issues and disability, and I want to start off with Andre Gladden, and I've got Dee Martin, his sister, who's going to be taking part in the show very shortly. We've got her in the group. She's live on Skype. But I just want to read this particular part first, right? The man shot by Portland police on Sunday struggled with mental health problems and was seen at the emergency room at Adventist Medical Center in southeast Portland before he was killed, according to family members. Police shot Andre Gladden, 36, inside an apartment less than a mile from the front doors of the hospital's emergency room, the very same hospital emergency room that he had just visited. Exactly why he was at the hospital remains unclear. Why we didn't even know that he had went to hospital, said his sister. We don't know what he went to the hospital for. Gladden was an African-American man from Sacramento who was important. I want to skip all of that. He was taking medication for bipolar disorder. While it's still unclear why Gladden was at the hospital, the fact that he was there at all raises questions about his well-being and his mental state the day police shot and killed him. And I just want to go around that sentence there again. While it's still unclear why Gladden was at the hospital, the fact that he was there at all raises questions about his well-being and his mental state the day police shot and killed him. Now, we unraveled some of this last week when I had Dee, his sister, on the show. But it's quite obvious. And I said to Dee, if I remember correctly, I said to Dee, she hasn't been able to get hold of the 911 call. And the one thing that I wanted to understand was, what was the state of the guy's voice or his panic levels when he called 911? Did he give the impression that he was under threat, that he felt threatened? Dee, are you there? If you're there, can you just come in on that? Because that's kind of where we were tied up last week, and then we'll get everybody else involved with their views as well. Tell us a bit more about that, please.
Okay, well, hey, Kervin, thanks for having me. Just going over a couple of the articles. Desmond himself, which is the witness of the home that Andre appeared at, he did state and a multitude of comments that Andre did not appear to be threatening. He did not threaten him in any manner. He looked disheveled. Andre conveyed to him that he was released from the hospital. In the same article, he denied that, on 2 occasions, denied that he believed that he was released from the hospital due to his behavior. Now, I don't know what an individual would look like being released from the hospital. His band was on him. He also stated that he saw the road.
Dee, just 1 second. I think it would be fair for the witness to think, under any form of impression and observation, that if he didn't think that the guy looked right, that maybe the guy hadn't been released but had just left of his own accord. I think that's a fair assumption. I think the most important thing to acknowledge from what he said was he didn't think that Andre was threatening.
Correct.
Right. So yeah, carry on.
Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, try to differentiate between whether or not he thought he had been released from hospital or not would not have been as a significant a factor to me, bearing in mind he had stated that Andre did not appear to be threatening. And I think it's a fair assumption for somebody to make based on their own observations, and that doesn't make their observations right, but they could assume that because Andre looked as disheveled as he was, he still had the band on his hand, and he had no footwear on his feet either, that maybe he just left the hospital of his own accord because he didn't want to be there. I think that would be a fair assumption.
Correct. I've recently got news that Andre did have a bag with him with some items. He had on what they stated was one shoe. The other shoe was in the bag. Right. So the multicolored blanket was from the hospital. Right. There's some information that is still apparently has not been released from to us. But the witness did state that he saw his hospital gown under his shirt. It was hanging from his shirt. What was failed to mention is that although my brother was labeled an intruder, he had a conversation with Desmond for the amount of 5 to 7 minutes. So it was, I understand that he approached a stranger's home asking for help. And an intruder is a person entering a residence or a business with a criminal intent. There was no criminal intent displayed, Andre, via the witness, nor did the witness display that he felt in danger in any way, only observing based on the conversation that Andre felt that he was in danger.
So I want to bring Jerry in a minute, and I don't want to trip Jerry up. I want to give him the facts as we know it. It's safe to say, Jerry, that the police were not aware that Andre was registered blind until after they killed him. But prior to them finding out that he was registered blind, they took the time out to fabricate their evidence and suggest that he was attacking them with a knife. When Andre arrived at the house, Andre was suffering from paranoid schizophrenia and believed that his life was in danger and wasn't sure that the guy that was presenting himself was in fact a police officer. In fact, he actually thought that this guy was actually out to kill him and said so to the witness on the door. Now, my concern is, you're an officer, you arrive on the scene, there's a very confusing situation taking place. There's a guy that's panicking, trying to get away from you, not running because he can't run, but he's pleading with the guy on the door to let him in because that guy, referring to the police officer, is trying to kill him. As a police officer, shouldn't your first port of call have been to try and calm down that situation and reassure the individual who was having this episode that you were not foe, that you were friend? I don't. How best could a police officer have handled that situation that it might not have led into the fatality that it turned into, Jerry, based on what you've heard so far?
It's based on communication skills, and I've spoken about this until I'm blue in the face, that most police academies limit communication skills to maybe a half a day out of thousands of hours or 1,000 hours of training. Police are just not trained to communicate well, and it's a shame because 97% of their job involves good communication skills, and a lot of these could be de-escalated and resolved if they would take the time to deal with the circumstance and communication. There is a problem within police departments and their training, in that it's to get control of the situation rapidly. And the problem with that, especially if you have a mentally ill individual, is they're not going to seem reasonable because they don't understand. And you need to slow it down, take some time to talk to them. And there's the pressure within the police department to get the thing resolved, get it done, and move on to the next case. Unfortunately, when that happens and a person's not responding, then police respond to the next level of force, and that leads to unlawful killings. And this is a shame. It could have been resolved with some communication skills, and I'm presuming that there was more than one officer on the scene at the time, so they had plenty of time to calm it down and not go to the level that they went to.
Dee, can you clarify that for Jerry? How many officers are you aware of were at the scene at the time when the police officer shot Andre?
So it was one officer that arrived at the time. There was no clear indication of police appearing on the scene. No, obviously the visual aspect was removed for Andre's disability. So he did not see them, wasn't able to identify a badge. There were no sirens, anything of that sort. Just a person who was awakened out of their sleep via shuffle, someone coming his way, which further escalated the issue for him, with already being under the impression that his life was hanging in the balance. The based on the report states that he called for backup at the time of encountering Andre, moments after, but then it was recently released that he called for backup after Andre was shot, and then backup arrived, equivalent to 30 to 45 seconds after Andre was shot.
And there were clear pictures of these officers trying to get stories straight. Am I getting the right story?
Correct.
Yeah. As they stood by the side, just trying to work out, and the problem being is, at this point, while they were trying to corroborate their stories, none of them actually knew that Andre was registered blind.
No. My impression of it was, in this article that I'm referring to, Desmond had the impression that he was blind to some degree because of the absence of the eye and how the socket droops in. But he had no idea that the other eye had no use. So he was aware of that. Was considered Vasu? No, he was not. In fact, I believe that's the reason why he planted the weapon, under the suspicion that he had vision in that eye. The officers that arrived after the shooting immediately saw the knife sticking out of the wood floor, very, very prominently out of the floor, as if someone just stuck it there. So they automatically identified the weapon as a common carry for police officers, since they are first responders. So that was not hidden, which I was surprised, but the officers did automatically, it drew to their attention first upon their arrival. So again, how that happened, I have no idea. He's stating that he saw this knife after Andre was shot, and then after he was tased. So it's mixed information. That's why the family it's so hard to draw this picture, because the story has changed so many times.
I just want to bring in one of the other guys in for a minute, and probably I'll bring in Scott very, very quickly. Scott, as far as the knife was concerned, the question that lies outstanding is that this was a double-edged blade knife. In other words, cut both sides. Andre being blind, and they're now trying to claim that the knife would have been in his waist, but yet there are no cuts to his waist. How would you view that as your parents? You've lost your own son. I'm just trying to get you to put yourself in Dee's family's shoes, for example, where the police are trying to justify their kill by claiming that Andre came at them with a knife. But a knife he could not have possibly had, and they couldn't have known that he couldn't have possibly had it, because at the time they planted it and tried to use it as evidence, they were not aware that he was blind.
Kervin and all of you, it's just sickening to me. This story is so troubling that, the officers make every attempt to, again, use their blue wall of silence, the blue wall of defense of officers to craft a story to cover up a mistake. They made a mistake. We know it. You know it. They know it. All they had to really do was watch this young man. They had to just stand back, retreat, use common sense. It's just sickening to me. It's this take control. What Jerry said: take control of the situation, pull out your gun, demand compliance. And without knowing that suspect might be deaf, might be mentally impaired, might be just having a reaction to a medication. Rather than use common sense, Kervin and team, this kind of kick butt mentality, it's just shocking to me. And it's the pattern. It's the pattern that we've all come to see. And my reaction is, where's common sense? Just stand back and watch and try to communicate with the suspect first.
Here's the thing. Let me come back to it again, because this statement just keeps staring me in the face, right? While it's still unclear why Gladden was at the hospital, the fact that he was there at all raises questions about his well-being and his mental state the day police shot and killed him. Now, just going back to Dee very quickly before I flip onto Yolanda. Dee, Andre had told this guy that he'd from the hospital. The guy had told 911 that this guy had been to the hospital. They were aware that they were dealing with a guy who had either escaped or left the hospital, right?
Correct.
So, yet their approach, and this is a question, when we talked about the dash cam and the body cam and everything else, I really wish we would have been able to see how he approached the property, how he approached the potential suspect, how he approached that doorway, how he approached the situation as Andre clamored for help, banging on this guy's door, asking him to be let in. How he approached, what was his demeanor, what was his countenance, what did he look like, what was he acting like when he got there? Because that would give us a better picture as to why he found it so necessary to A, pull out his gun, and then B, pull out the trigger. Do you not think so, Yolanda?
Yes, I do. Just common sense. I tell people a lot of times, common sense may not be common, but it should at least be affordable. So go rent some. There's no way that you can approach a situation, and I've been in that vein since '93. I've been a security officer, a supervisor, I carry a gun. I've made arrests. I got 8 felony arrests, 5 convictions, and 3 people doing life, and I didn't have a weapon. I got them without a weapon. And it's not about really being
I agree.
It's
I remember doing this show about 4 years ago when we first started to look at the stats of police brutality. And I remember asking somebody back then, we have a lot of stats for how many people are killed by cops week in, week out. How many of those stats relate to female cops being in fear of their life? Because my presumption would still be, if anybody should be in fear of their life, would be a female who was confronted by a potential thug or villain.
Right.
So the stats for killed by cops should be higher by females who are caught up in that than males, but it's not, because they actually have
it's at less the point than 10%.
Absolutely. So Jerry, sorry Yolanda, I just got to flip back to Jerry, and then I want to bring Patrick in a minute. Jerry, why do you think that females have less stats on being in fear of their life and killing innocent victims than males?
I got to be careful here because it's going to sound a little sexist, but women are much better at communicating.
I agree.
But it's so true.
That's just the way it is. They take the time to understand and communicate, where men, especially law enforcement officers, are all about control, power and control, and compliance. And if in this case, the officers knew that somebody had left the hospital and had been informed that, then it's even more critical that they needed to take the time to communicate rather than go to the hands-on. There are police departments where their mentality is, we'll ask you once, we'll tell you, then we'll make you. And that period of time can go seconds. And unfortunately, life isn't that confined and that succinct. There are times where somebody may just be having a bad day, and if you take 5 minutes to talk to them, you can get the situation de-escalated and settled down. I happen to be in a department where we were very small. We didn't have a lot of backup. Our backup was generally 27 minutes away. So we had to use verbal skills. And we had officers go from our department to a much larger department where they didn't use the communicative skills. And it was clear that, no, you don't take the time. We don't have the time to do that. You make them do what you want them to do, and then you move on. And that has got to change in law enforcement culture, especially since a lot of our state psychiatric hospitals have been closed and prison becomes the ad hoc mental health facility. And it just needs to change. We need to use communication skills and some compassion in dealing with one another.
I like that word, compassion. It's a godly word, but we'll come to that very shortly. I just want to bring Patrick in. Before I do, Patrick, I just want you to consider, while it's still unclear why Gladden was at the hospital, the fact that he was there at all raises questions about his well-being and his mental state the day police shot and killed him. Portland police officer Consider Vosu fired 3 times, hitting Gladden twice in the lungs at point blank range, the medical examiner told Gladden's family. Now, bearing in mind you're an officer, you've just come onto the scene, it's a call from and the call from the house owner, right, wasn't that he was being threatened or somebody was attacking him with a knife or a gun or trying to burgle his house. The guy was basically, Andre had come, had knocked the door, said he was in trouble, needed some help, went to sleep on the stairs, and then the guy had kind of come back out, saw that Andre was still there, and had enough, wanted Andre to leave, and Andre wouldn't leave. So that was really what we were dealing with at the time. But the police were aware that he had been to the hospital, that he wasn't feeling well, that his mental state wasn't right, and yet he shot 3 times, twice in the lungs at point blank range. Do you think that's the right approach, or how would you, as an ordinary person, not even with police training, Patrick, how would you have expected to have seen that situation handled or approached?
Well, of course, quite differently than that. But sadly, that is so indicative of the nonsensical, even against their own protocol, that we've seen in countless cases. Every case of everyone involved today has that air of just being not, actions that were senseless. But what we have to do, Kervin, is that we have to ask ourselves, because we put a lot of the burden on the police, but I want to shift the onus onto the people. We have to ask ourselves, is this what we want? Is this acceptable we're a nation that has been at war for the past 18 years with scores of returning vets and all of that time. So, and it's been said that, the deepest wounds are the ones that you can't see. And so we have all these people coming back, and a lot of these calls that are made are about people that are vets. We have Icarus Randolph in Wichita, who was killed July 4th, 2014 on a mental crisis call. But these are the people that this is happening to in disproportionate numbers. And to Jerry, you said that about women having such low rates. And that's just the way it is. And I hear your concern and all that. But the truth is that men can learn sensitivity. I think we discussed on the last program that, and I think it was you that had said that something like 6 hours of training for those in mental health crisis for officers. That seems just totally unacceptable to me.
It is absolutely unacceptable. And I didn't mean to imply that men cannot learn to do that. There are a lot of men that are very good communicators. That is not the culture within the law enforcement community, and it needs to change. More emphasis needs to be put on communication, because 97% of an officer's job involves communication. And for them to have not have 97% of their training around communication skills is obscene.
Just a quick question before we move on, Jerry. How much responsibility do you put, or how much blame would you put on the militarized style of training police officers this day? I'm fully aware, and it's been documented, that they brought in the Israeli militant troops to train police officers in certain parts of America. That military style, that militant style of training, how much impact has that had on an officer's ability to think like an ordinary human being as opposed to thinking like a soldier?
It has a tremendous impact. But I want to be careful, because some of that military type training is essential in certain circumstances. However, that's the go-to. I'll ask you once, I'll tell you, then I make you. It is the go-to, rather than taking a few minutes and communicating and figuring out what you have. When you have the mentality that you're going to immediately go and respond by force, then you escalate the situation. And if you look across the country and you look at the use of force protocols, the first thing they'll talk to you about is de-escalation, and you don't see it happening in circumstances across the country.
So when we start talking about de-escalation, and we go to, let me just quickly bring in Yolanda a minute. We've been talking about how the officer should have approached Andre. I mean, Andre initially would have had his back to him as he was trying to get into the house. He was pleading with the guy. The owner of the house, to let him in because he was frightful for his life. He was in fear. He was the one that was in fear of his life. The question that I asked Dee, right, especially in regards to the knife that they later were to try and plant on him and try to suggest that he was the one that was coming at the officer with the knife. If Andre was in fear of his life, not believing this guy behind him to be an officer, why didn't he use his knife then?
That's a great question.
You know?
It's a great question. Andre, being his sister, knowing his behavior, I'm dealing with Andre since the first encounter, which caused him to be blind. I shared that with you last time. Andre, my impression, knowing him, Andre can suffer for he has a high tolerance for pain. However, when it gets so bad, he will go and seek medical attention. If it's the case of where he's in a mental crisis, I don't believe that that could be the main reason he visited the hospital, because when he gets in that state, he isolates himself. He's not so talkative. He wants to isolate himself. So I feel as though when he visited the hospital, it's more so in regards to pain because of the pellet fragments still being in his body. But honestly, if in the event that Andre had a weapon on him, which I'm most certain that he did not, that would have been the most prominent time to present or defend himself, given the situation, him feeling as if his life was in danger. With this knife, the officer's compartment for this specific knife, the other officers noticed that compartment was emptied. There was a scuffle after entering the home. If this knife was on him, double-edged, he would have hurt him. He could have killed himself.
But he would have had abrasions. Yeah, but he would have had abrasions, cuts, marks of this knife while they were having this struggle, because it had no sheath. It was an open knife with a double-edged blade.
Correct. So there's no way for him to physically have the ability to wrestle around with the officer with this knife and not hurt himself at all. To get up, pull this weapon, charge him, be tased, this weapon falls, and he gets up and then locates this weapon again to charge again. So that is all. It's all so confusing.
And that's the additional question. They are trying to get you to believe, that was what they tried to cover up. By the way, Jerry, I need you to hear this, right? Because after the scuffle, the knife was meant to have dropped, and the blind man was meant to have found the knife again and come at the officer a second time. Now, bearing in mind, remember what we said, all of this was corroborated, all of this was put together before they knew he was blind. Surely, once you realize he was blind, somebody needs to say, we messed up here.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously. The other question I have, did the officer have any cuts or clothing cuts on him if they were struggling with a knife?
No, he did not. There was no mention of the officer wounded in any way, or his clothing torn, cut, or ripped.
So there was no injuries on your brother, and there were no injuries on the officer. And a blind man was finding a knife and threatening an officer with the knife.
Correct.
Yes. But the boggling part to me is that the officer later stated that Andre took this knife off of him. Andre physically removed this knife from his tactical vest, or his vest. For him to have done that, he needs to be able to visibly locate it. I'm just trying to understand how
I kind of missed it, but I don't know how I missed that. So the knife that Andre was supposed to have been using against the officer was the officer's own knife?
That's what I've read in the report, that Andre took the knife off of him. But if you recall back, the witness stated that he didn't see Andre pull a knife at all. They just saw it magically appear and charge him with the knife. So that's corroborating there. So we're going to have to pick a story here, because either one of them are contradictory to each other. But if he didn't see Andre pull the knife from his waistband, his pocket, anything, but then later on the officer states that he pulled it from his vest, how would he be able to do that?
He wouldn't. And this is a common theme. I mean, Scott's dealing with this with his son Tyler as well, in that in reading the prosecutor's report, it says that Tyler attempted to stab the officer in the head a couple times, and what they thought was a knife turned out to be the officer's pen that was removed from the pocket. Yet there's no way there's no place in the that I could see in the video that they released that Tyler was ever trying to do that. When Tyler was being bitten by a dog, he was trying to get the dog to release his leg. He was not attempting to hit or strike the officer. And yet that's a common theme where you have a problem, they're going to say the officer's weapon was removed, the guy was trying to get the weapon, or he was trying to somehow harm the officer, which gives that credence of, okay, I was fearful for my life and I could go to lethal force. And it's preposterous. And it's just laden with BS that it just irritates me. I'm sorry. I'm getting very passionate.
And Kervin, I wanted to mention as well. Now, I don't know, this is not, none of this is an area of my expertise. So please excuse me if I'm not wording it correctly, but I'm not familiar with this type of encounter at all. But I don't know if this is normal. But in this report, it states that, after he was shot and everything, they cuffed him. They cuffed him and left him there on the ground until they can confirm that no one else is in the home, after this information was already made aware to the officers. So until they were able to clear the premises, then they went to go ahead and perform life-saving techniques on him, in which he was cuffed. So later on, they did say to where they lift his shirt, there was no other wounds except for the bullet wounds. So that lets me know that the officers that arrived on the scene saw no lacerations on him, and that's via them and the statements via the report. So there is no other lacerations found on him other than the wounds. He was only uncuffed after the paramedics arrived and ordered the officers to uncuff him so that they can provide him the proper life-saving techniques. But still to no avail. Andre did pass in the home and was able to later be revived, in which he was pronounced deceased at the hospital. It goes into really gruesome detail as to his last moments. Hearing that really set me up pretty bad on the emotional side. Although I don't have a visual aside from what I've read, it was not a good encounter. Period. Andre, like I said, he is not the violent type at all. If in case he asked anybody for help, he needed it. He is not the type to just behave in the manner in which the result ended the way that it did. But for him to seek his help, it was definitely needed. And another portion of the witness's statement, which baffled me a lot, it was like a gut punch, was that he automatically assumed that Andre was on some type of drug, because he states that his adrenaline was through the roof. Because again, like I said, Andre is about 146 pounds. The witness is about 280, along with the officer. Desmond had his foot on Andre's neck as the officer advised him to help him apprehend Andre, as the officer was on his back. The witness stated that he got loose like he's never seen before. So he's saying that Andre subdued them both, and that's how he got to his feet. I don't know that to be something that actually happens. I've never heard or saw an officer include surrounding civilians to help apprehend a suspect. Now, if they do it on their own, then that's one thing. But to keep the safety, I don't ever see that happening. So that's where it kind of draws into me. There's so many things that is happening out of the norm. that I just can't wrap my mind around. And I'm just surprised that everything that they're trying to combat this with falls with this is a mental ill person and he's crazy out of his mind, and that's why this happened.
Okay, can I speak for a moment?
Absolutely.
Okay. First of all, the de-escalation is just a fun word that they like to throw around. Nobody's really trying to de-escalate anything. A lot of male officers run around with this superhero complex that they're the man and that they have the power and that everybody is supposed to do what they want, when they want, how they want. Um, as far as your brother goes, if he was carrying the weapon within his clothing, in his waist, like they claim, there would have been an impression of the knife at the very least on his body. It would have remained visible for at least an hour. If he had pulled the weapon from the officer's vest, there is a possibility that he could have, as he's pushing him off of it, felt it pulled and not knowing what he's pulling, but knowing that he's trying to get this man off of him. As for his weight, his size, and adrenaline, yeah, he could get both of them up off of him because he is literally in fear of his life being taken. So he has the adrenaline. There's probable cause for that. But for this man to have intervened on the behest of the officer and put his foot on your brother's neck, he would have risked snapping his spine trying to get up. The police have a real bad habit of creating stories, and they're not smart, they're not clever, but they tell you you're supposed to believe them. You know, my daughter was shot, and they tried to say that she triggered the weapon, though the gun was supposed to be pointing down to the ground within a in-the-waist holster on the right side of the officer. But my daughter got shot in her chest. So we already know it's not take what they say with a grain of salt. Get a whole table.
So then here's the thing. When we hear such outlandish stories in order to support and justify a police officer's shoot or kill, why is it that well-trained professionals in the legal system are not going, that's a load of hogwash? Anybody can answer that.
Too many friends in the system.
Go on, Jerry.
They got friends. They got friends they don't want to make upset.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Jerry.
That's part of it, Yolanda. I absolutely agree with you. Another part of it is these well-trained professionals. Prosecutors are not well-trained. They are well-trained in the law. They're not well-trained in crime scene reconstruction. And unless they take the time to learn that, they're going to accept what the officers say as being truthful. And that's the problem. They don't question. I want to answer a few things. It is standard practice to handcuff an individual after they've been shot or they've been taken down. That's just an officer safety thing. But immediately after they've been handcuffed, immediately there should have been some type of rendering of first aid. And once you have enough people on the scene, then you can uncuff the person. That's not uncommon. It is also it's not common, but it's not uncommon to pull in assistance from a citizen in a life and death situation. I don't see that being the case here, and it's never acceptable to put your foot on somebody's throat or neck. That's excessive, period.
Do you know,
Kervin, could I say something real
absolutely quick? Patrick, come on.
Is that you asked the question about, when we see these outlandish things happen, why don't professionals within say something about it? And I think that's that's something that we need to talk about is, do officers really have a safe place where they could report the abuse that they might see within their precinct or with other officers? Because as I've seen it in every story that I've read about, these officers, most clearly the ones that have came forth, definitely have to deal with that and have done so in with the threat of losing their careers. So could that also be a component why we don't have more officers or more people with inside agencies coming forth and being more transparent?
It's funny you should say that, and I'm sure Jerry's going to answer that in a second, because I'm going to ask him to. But whether or not I'm right or not, I've had it said on this show on many occasions by former law enforcement officers, the difficulty, and I had Cheryl Dorsey on here about 2 years ago, powerful ex-sergeant of Los Angeles. She's written a book, and I forget what the book's called now, but she's going up and down the country sharing her story with all those that will listen. But the fear of your officers leaving you unsupported in the next call that you might get where there is lethal weapons available is part of the stranglehold that is upon you if you dare to speak out against your officers. And I'll get Jerry to come in and support or dismiss that.
That's absolutely correct. I mean, ultimately, the culture is if you speak out against an officer, you're either going to be left out on your own without backup, or you're going to be shunned and removed from that department. The culture does not accept somebody speaking out. In fact, I was involved in a shooting where the officer used a less than lethal beanbag from a shotgun on an individual that was unarmed, and I testified against him. And the chief of police, had the chief of police not been removed, I would have been removed from the department, because at that point, I had people telling me, you cannot speak against the officer. You're going to be left alone. If that's what you're going to do, we're not going to deal with you anymore. I also witnessed an officer when I was on patrol, initially on patrol, using excessive force. I spoke to the officer. He told me I didn't see everything. I needed to watch better. And then I went to my sergeant. Sergeant, sure you want to go there? Because if you go there, 3 minutes is an awful long time to wait for backup when you're getting your ass kicked. And that was very clear that if I speak out and I do the right thing, I'm going to be left alone, and my own safety is going to be put at risk. That's the culture, and the culture is you do not speak out against an officer, and if you do, you're not going to have a job or a career.
That's not okay.
It's not okay.
No, it's not okay.
Scott,
Not okay
Scott, when you imagine what your son went through, when he was trapped in that doorway with the dogs and the officer, etc., imagine the truth, because the truth didn't come out, did it?
The truth is not completely out. Obviously, I'm listening and I'm thinking about my son's death, as Oliver's was terribly violent at the end. He did not live a peaceful death. Did not have a peaceful death. It was very violent, very drawn out, over an hour of bleeding and violent acts. This whistleblowing thing, I hate to put Jerry on the spot, but I'm thinking there needs to be an avenue for, let's say, honest cops or ethical cops to be able to whistleblow without their personal safety or career in danger. That gets back to the blue wall of silence issue. It gets back to ladies being involved who are more sensitive and more communicative just in their life. And I don't think having lady officers will lessen crime fighting. I think it might increase the effectiveness of crime fighting across the country. But this blue wall of silence, the lack of civilian oversight into use of force settings, and the fact that you can't, an honest cop's, he's got a choice. You give up your career or your life's in danger. It's just that cowboy culture that's somehow been allowed to breed across the United States, and then in certain departments it's much worse than others. It just dumbfounds me. I'm just shocked. And as I've stated to you all and anybody that listen, I was completely ignorant of this world until my son was killed, and then I got brought into this world of blaming the parents. And I'll just going to say one thing, then I'll shut up. But my case has been moving forward, and we're through the legal process. And of course, no, I can't say a whole lot about it. But I have to say the main defense, I will say this, that the defendants are using is to blame my wife and I for not being more responsible in the raising and care of our son and therefore our weakness as parents resulted in our son making acts and doing things that required the officers and the guard to kill him. So my wife and I, in effect, are the ones being blamed for the officer and the guard killing my son. That is where.
And the bottom line is, we're talking about a husband and a wife who
That's
are.
correct. My wife and I, 43 years of marriage. We were married 6 years before we had our son, and he was well planned, as was our daughter, and well loved, and yet, believe it or not, that is the primary defense. I can't be specific about what was said, but my wife and I are the ones now that are being, in effect, pointed at as the reason they had to shoot our son was poor parenting.
But you brought your son up in a godly home.
We're going through.
It's a standard practice, and it's terrible. I'm sorry. What happens is the government then further victimizes the victims. They've lost a family member and now turning around and trying to blame them for the actions of the officers. It's unconscionable.
We're coming up to the last half. We're coming up to the last half hour, and I want to look at just a little bit into Mauricio Barron's case before we go back and look at the two of them. So stick around, D, because we ain't finished with you yet. Because with Mauricio Barron, his was slightly different. They tried to claim that his was an attempt of suicide by cop. Now, just to give you a little bit of a background into this, they also tried to claim that this guy had some serious mental health problems and been acting strange for a while. The truth of the matter is, he had been approached in a bar by a Taliban terrorist who was actually under surveillance. And this guy was trying to recruit him, right? Mauricio contacted law enforcement and told them about this guy, only to then find his own self being under surveillance. He had a car outside his home watching, and he began to panic because the car outside his home, he didn't know whether it was the terrorists that were dogging him, stalking him, or whether it was the FBI that was stalking and dogging him. And up to this day, we have very little evidence. There is no evidence whatsoever to support their claim that he had any mental health related issues. And I had Letitia on here just a few weeks ago, who testified right here on this show that there were no known diagnosis of mental health related issues. There were no. His mother had contacted the law enforcement and said that her son had been pretty worked up recently, but he was worked up because of this encounter he'd had with this terrorist that was under surveillance. The problem being is, after the car got dumped, he's missing. He's missing for several hours. And upon him being shot, and they're claiming that he had gone into his waist like he was pulling out a gun, and that he stood in a shooting stance, which is what caused the officer to open fire. From 8 feet, how could you stand in a shooting stance and an officer not be aware that you actually haven't got a weapon in your hand? Now, that first question, it has to be to you, Jerry, because the bottom line was no weapon was found. He had no weapon. But the officer is claiming that he opened fire because Mauricio stood in a shooting. When a CP officer arrived, Fox says Barron claimed to have a gun, ignored commands not to reach for it, and then came at the officer and assumed a shooting stance. Even if he claimed to have a gun, pulled his hands out from behind his back, right, and stood in a shooting stance, because the officers, they're not saying that they shot him when his hands was behind his back. They're saying he stood before the officer from 8 feet in a shooting stance, which caused the officer to open fire. Surely at 8 foot, you'd be able to tell whether somebody had a weapon in their hand or not, Jerry?
Oh, okay. This is a difficult question because you're correct in your assumption. The other problem is you're forgetting the raised adrenaline and what's called visual acuity. When you think somebody is going to kill you, you think there is a gun in their hand, you're not necessarily focused on the hand, you're focused on the action. And if the hands come up in the form of a shooting stance, you're going to respond. You're not going to wait to see if you can see the gun. You're going to draw and shoot.
Okay.
Your life depends upon that. You don't have the time. Action always is faster than reaction. And we see that in training. If I literally sat there with a cap gun pointed at a guy who was walking with a gun, and he said, "I'll shoot you anytime I want to, and I'll shoot you faster than you can pull the trigger." And every time he did, my reaction was slower than his action. And they did that with several people, and they demonstrated that. So there's some sensitivity from my part in somebody drawing or making the motion to draw, because if they're making that threatening motion, you're probably not going to see whether they have a gun in their hand or not. You're going to react because that's the way you're trained to react. I'm not saying that training is necessarily correct, but I'm also saying it's not wrong because your life will depend upon that. And most police shootings occur in less than somewhere between 3 and 7 feet apart from one another.
Now, let me, because I'm setting you up for a trap here, Jerry.
I understand.
The original claim was that Barron apparently stole a car at knife point as a friend drove him to hospital. Right? So now the question has to be, where did the gun come from?
Good question.
Furthermore, as the officer claims that Maurizio was coming at him in a shooting stance, there were 2 other officers directing traffic. Why would the 2 officers be directing traffic and not supporting their officer who was under threat?
They shouldn't be.
And finally, so that we can all get into the discussion, because this was on the freeway, one of the busiest, in fact, I was told the busiest road in that area, right? The California, oh no, where is it? It was of Riverside. It was in California, and it was a freeway, and I'm trying to see what the name of the freeway was. It's not in this particular story. It's in another story that I was looking at. It doesn't give the name of the freeway, but I do remember when Letitia was on the show, she said it's the busiest freeway in the state, right? So at the time that the car is stopped in the middle of the road, and it says here that the California Highway Patrol says a man who was shot after running in traffic claimed to have a gun and apparently wanted the officer to kill him. So he was running in the traffic. So now he's on the busiest highway in the state, which would have had to have come to a standstill, which was why the 2 officers was there trying to manage the traffic, right? With a stopped car in the middle of the road. Our next question has to be, why is there no other statements from any other witnesses sat in the car parks, parked vehicles on the highway, right, to corroborate the officer's story that this is what actually took place?
Because they probably didn't stop to get the names or interview the people that were there.
The cars were stopped. The cars were stopped, and the officers were stopped in traffic.
The witnessing cars that were sitting back behind, they probably did not get any statements from the individuals there. They just let them drive on and didn't get their names or anything else. So then you're stuck with the officer's story.
So possibly, I can accept that. But is that not against protocol in a situation like that?
Absolutely, it's against protocol.
So what should have happened, Jerry?
They should have shut everything down. They should have gotten the names of the people that could have seen, and they should have interviewed them initially, done a field interrogation interview, and then the detectives should have called them in and interviewed them in more detail if somebody said they had seen something.
And I would have imagined, would it be a fair statement to say that they should have called for additional help and backup to help interview the multiple people that would have been stuck in that traffic, so that they could have got the statements as quickly as possible without anybody having a chance to tell each other what they think they saw?
Absolutely. At the very least, they should have separated the people and gone to them and spoke to them. That's what I meant by a field interrogation interview. Patrol needed to get a statement from each person and get their story locked down so it could be investigated further with the detective division.
Now, just very quickly, Yolanda, I know you was watching the show the day that we did Letitia Barron. What was your observations on what she had to say about what took place on that?
Pretty much the same thing that happened in my daughter's case. No policy, protocol, or procedures were followed. And that's something that happens way too often. Well, let's just say dang near 99% of the time. They will not follow the procedures and protocols because then they get caught up in their story. I have a friend who was in Nam, and he said that his sergeant told him there's only two stories that can come out of any combat situation, yours and theirs. And the only way you get to tell yours first is if you put them down.
Now here's the thing, and I want to just go to Patrick with this. They believed that they were pursuing a man that had serious mental health related issues. That was their claim. So their approach, again, because I keep talking about approach, their approach lacked very little compassion. The word that Jerry used earlier on, I said I was going to come back to that word. If you are dealing with a man that's frantic, paranoid, and in a severe or critical state of mental health, should your approach be, gun held, stop or I'll shoot?
Well, they use mental health issues as an excuse for why they killed somebody. Because they know that a lot of people are afraid of people with mental issues because they don't know how to deal with them. They haven't been taught how to have a conversation with somebody who has mental issues. So if you use that fear, that phobia as a weapon against them, people don't look too deep. They just say, shoot, they couldn't really help them anyway.
Okay,
so that's their excuse for don't look too. It's the trick of if you concentrating on the right hand, you don't know what the left hand is doing.
Okay, let me give you this understanding, and I'm going to go to Patrick next once I've finished. I come from a pretty violent past, a history before I found the Lord and turned my life around and stuff like that. And I was used to using all kinds of weapons, guns, knives, you name it. But the one thing that I had, and I'm not saying that I'm unique or special because I know there was a lot of people that were like me. The one thing that I never did was I never had a row with a man when he was drunk. I was confident in my ability. I knew I could take care of myself, and I knew I would deal with the matter if I had a problem with somebody. I had no problem with confronting somebody with an issue. But I didn't want to deal with a man who was drunk because he was highly likely to remember why I was annoyed with him or what he had done wrong. So I would very often go back and revisit that individual when they were sober and straight. And then I'd ask them if they remembered what took place the night before. And if they still felt as strongly as they did that night, then we can pick it back up again. But if they didn't, and they were sorry, I'd had much to drink, maybe I shouldn't have said what I said, then I'd let it go. Now that's common sense approach for me, right? Patrick, if you was encountered by somebody who you deemed to have serious, critical mental health related issues, how would you react to that individual? And you're not a police officer, by the way. I'm just talking as Joe Bloggs.
Exactly. And just living our everyday lives. I mean, we come into situations, all of us, where we have to defuse, certain situations. I mean, it's a part of life, so, but it goes back to the issue that as Jerry, I know that maybe it feels like we're beating up on you, sir. I assure you that we're not. You've actually helped restore some of my faith in police officers, and I want to thank you for that. But when police officers commit crimes, the call for justice becomes inverted. Whereas if you or I did it, it would be for the truth to come out, and all those investigations and the forensics and all the processes would be gone through, and they'd come to a logical conclusion more than likely. But when police are involved, that whole system is inverted, and the impetus is that the truth not come out. And that's what everything is centered about in the system, is to making sure that the police get to keep the tape and go over their testimony for hours, days, weeks. They get to amend certain parts as they see fit. We've heard about changing stories, which it's really become almost commonplace in a lot of these stories that you have departments that will change stories. So I think it's we need to be mindful that the call for justice when police are involved, more than likely is the call is going to be that the truth not come out.
Go ahead. I don't know. Somebody was going to come in and say something then. Okay, no worries. Let me just bring
this is Scott Rushing.
Okay,
Kervin, let me just interrupt you, and then
in,
I'll shut off. Yeah, I'm sorry, Jerry, for picking on you. But what we really are is, you can tell we're desperate to be educated. As I said, I was ignorant up until 20 months ago of these issues that we've touched on, and I had a hard lesson. I've had a very hard lesson, and a phrase I like to use is my son paid the butcher's bill for the lack of investment in the proper training that we're all talking about, de-escalation and common sense and people skills. And to me, that's what crime fighting should be about, not about, who's the toughest dog on the block and taking control and knowing how to shoot someone in the torso. I mean, those are not peace officers. That's not what a peace officer is. A peace officer should be crime fighter, and I just see this pattern again, and you're just confirming our point of view, and so please apologize if I'm picking on you, because you're really educating me, so thank you.
Here's the thing. I know that Jerry doesn't take it personal. I bring him on his show deliberately because Jerry is open and honest about the shortcomings of law enforcement. And I regard him as a dear friend who is able to advance us far further in the knowledge that we lack in police protocol, procedures, policies, and principles. And the funny thing is, with Jerry, he's very open and frank and honest about what he thinks are the shortfalls in policing. So I know for a fact that Jerry doesn't feel like you guys are attacking him. It's just that we're throwing certain questions in his direction because he's the best placed person to respond, answer them, and give us an insight as to a policeman's thinking, state of mind, and protocol in a given circumstance. So I understand that you got. In fact, I'm accepting their apologies on your behalf, Jerry. Right? Hi, Jerry. I'm not sure if Jerry's by his mic at the minute. He should be there. But look, let's go back to D. So D, we've really had a real talk about these states of mental health with Mauricio and with Andre. And it's been a very open and frank discussion as to the depth of wrong that was done, right? What could be done, do you think, in your mind, layman's terms, in order to make managing mental health or approaching mental health in policing different or better?
I think there's a huge gap that we need to cover in regards to mental health dealing with police officers. I don't believe they should be alone or the first responders in regards to a person suffering from mental health. There's a lot of which they go through that police officers don't understand. I think when they are being approached, you have to have approach it at a certain mindset. Although it may or may not be criminal activity going on, the mental capacity and where that person is at that time needs to be assessed. They need to have someone to see what's going on and kind of communicate a little better. Everything is not solved with bullets, batons, and tasers. We can't approach everything in a manner like that. It's unsafe for them. Having a mental issue of any sort is not a crime, and it should not be punishable by death by any means. So there needs to be a bridge to where we can communicate better with our community, those suffering from mental illness, and try to bridge that gap to get a better understanding how these types of situations should be approached. The last thing I think that should be happening is that we should have an encounter like Andre's or many others. That is the wrong way to approach it. And we've saw the wrong way so many times as a citizen, as an American. I'd like to see the right way be done. I would love to see what that looks like. I'd do anything in my power to help participate in that because it is a huge thing. And they are a value to our community. I don't care who thinks it's the opposite. They definitely are a value to our community, regardless of the disability. And these people have families. They have loved ones. They have people that count on them as well. With my brother having the bipolar schizophrenia, obviously we loved him, still do. So we would have loved to see that situation approached in a different manner. And his situation had nothing to do with the lack of family support. There was a mention that he was homeless. I'm like, seriously? So it's just excuse after excuse, whether he was homeless or had this mental issue. It took nothing away from the person that he initially was. And I think it can be handled in a better way. In fact, I can see it being handled in a better way. If we would all get on the same page and understand that each life has a value and it should be approached differently, I think that's when we'll be able to bridge the gap. But until we start to remove parts of ourselves because of our authority, then we can see a change happen. But until then, we have to acknowledge that it is a problem, and we need to find the right people and positions to help motion towards that goal.
Thank you very much for that, Dee. I just want to move to Scott very quickly. Again, we're fast running out of time. It's amazing how quickly these shows go. We have 2 hours at the start, and then before we know it, we're left with about 5 or 6 minutes to try and cram everything else in. The way that your son was handled, Scott, do you think that the police had better training, more compassion, the word that Jerry used earlier on? Do you think that we would have had you could have had a different outcome?
Yes, and I can add to that there's two current bits of legislation going through California state legislature right now. One is AB 392, the other is SB 430, I think is the number. 230. One is kind of a change in the use of force, just one word from reasonable use of force to necessary use of force regarding officer-involved shootings. And of course, the police unions and Friends of Police across the state are calling for an outcry that will endanger, officers if they're not allowed to use reasonable force versus necessary force. So that is going through the legislature, and I don't know where it's going to end up. But just one word of one, law has created a hue and cry up and down the state, lawsuits and countersuits. It just shows you how the police have just walled up behind this blue wall of silence and are resisting any change. And that is just, obnoxious. I mean, they should want to improve their services to the citizens and the taxpayers and the families. They shouldn't oppose, change. And let me add something, Kervin, which you might not know, and the listeners, that the current law in California regarding use of force dates back to 1872. 1872 is the current law, which allows law enforcement to use reasonable force use a reasonable amount of lethal force in subduing a suspect. That's the current law now. It's that old. And this one-word change has created a hue and cry that you wouldn't believe up and down the state from friends of police. And it's just indicative of this blue wall of science, the lack of enlightenment, the lack of change that Jerry was mentioning about, that we have got to get together somehow and affect changes in law enforcement across the country.
Absolutely. Amen. Thank you very much. I'm going to nip over to Patrick very shortly, but let me just make this point. Here in the UK, law enforcement or police officers, in response to responding to a call where there is a mental health related suspect at large, do not go unaccompanied. Here in the UK, we have what's referred to as the crisis team. The crisis team are specially trained mental health specialists. These are doctors, psychiatrists, people who know how to manage what questions to ask, people who are able to ascertain whether that individual is at risk to himself or others. They know the body language, the behaviors. So the police will come. If they've identified it as a mental health related issue, the crisis team will be called in, and the crisis team will go in first. Only if the crisis team can't resolve it and it is escalating to a point where the person either is at risk to themselves or at risk to others, right, are you likely to see the police go in there with additional force, where that person can be sectioned, where it is against their will, forcibly put into an institute, a residential institute, where they'll be able to be held against their will, put under medication, and brought back into a reasonable, good state of mental health. Now, if you had something like that working in America, Patrick, could you see that benefiting or changing the statistics of how many people we see affected, killed by cops who are mentally health affected?
Absolutely. We know the changes that we have to make. It's not... we have the studies, we have the numbers, we know that sensitivity training is effective. So yeah, absolutely, that would do wonders for addressing the problem or part of it.
So here's the thing. I've been told by police officers, law enforcement officers all over America that I've had on the show for the last 5 years, that they have built their local law enforcement office on the Robert Constable, the constabulary of the United Kingdom, that community kind of cop kind of guy, right? That's what they built it on. So if they've taken that and tried to replicate it in America, why haven't they tried to take the understanding and the compassionate stance of trying to look at a crisis team or people that are well trained in managing mental health, for them to let me just throw that one out to Yolanda. Why do we not see additional training, better training available for law enforcement officers to cope with and manage mental health? Have we lost you, Yolanda?
No, sorry, I'm here. Go ahead, I'm going here.
Okay, did you hear that question?
Okay. Now, could you repeat it,
yeah,
please?
So bearing in mind that we've been told umpteen times that America based their community style policing on the Robert Constable, the constabulary that was British constabulary that was built here in the United Kingdom. If they were so quick to take what they felt was a good template to open, why haven't they looked at what we're doing with mental health, like the crisis team, for example, and tried to replicate that, getting people better trained to cope and manage mental health in policing?
Because of things like that orange thing in the White House that think like him. It's about profit. Everything is about a dollar bill, and they worship that God. They worship money. So there's money in medication. There's money in not giving medication. There's money in treatment. There's money in not giving treatment. In the United States, the prisons are private. So they're for profit. Yeah. As long as you can keep those beds filled, you're making money. Coca-Cola, Pepsi, Tide, all of those companies are making money. Every aspect of a prison system is an outside company making money. So it doesn't benefit them to deal with it. It doesn't benefit them to come up with cures. It doesn't benefit them to give proper treatment or to give across the board equal treatment. That's why we're in this situation. And the police officers are buying into it because those with the money keep telling them, you're powerful. Yeah. You have the authority. Yeah. You make the decisions. And last time I checked, you just a man that put on a uniform like everybody else. Because if I cut you, you'll bleed. If I pull your heart out, you'll stop living.
Amen. I just want to quickly go to D because we're about to run out of time. D, if the state, if the commissioner, the mayor, those that are in charge, if they had turned round to you and said, once they'd realised that Andre was blind and everything else, if they had just turned around and said, you know what, we got this one wrong, we messed up, our officer panicked and got it wrong on the day, would that have been an easier pill to swallow?
I don't think so, because the problem still exists. If they admitted to it, it would give some peace. But it wouldn't fix anything. It wouldn't make me look at it differently. What they're doing is what I assumed. I already assumed everything that was said, everything that was done. I assumed it before it was given a voice. The family gave them a chance to get it out. If they made changes from that would be justified for me. If he was actually punished, that would be justification for me. Very minimal, because it won't bring him back, of course. But having them actually do something to notice the mistake, bring awareness to it, and change it moving forward would do a lot. It's too late for Andre, unfortunately, but it's not too late for the rest. There's a huge world that follows behind. And if we're going to continue to walk in these steps, then we don't have a future to look forward to. If their method is to kill what they can't understand or deal with, what laws will be governed amongst the land where there's no living? That makes no sense to me. We have to have a future. We have to have people to look forward to a future. It's nothing. The future means nothing if we continue in this manner, because we all have legacies here that are here. And God forbid I were to leave this place, I would not be safe as the world stands now. That my kids are still here living in this. So we definitely have to learn from our mistakes, and this one, it was a deadly mistake.
Okay, we've just we've just come to the end of the show. We've got 3 minutes left, and maybe Jerry is going to put in a message if he can still hear. Jerry's lost Skype. We're speaking to him on a messenger at the minute. For some reason, he can't get Skype to work his end. It's just cut off. And we would have liked a response from Jerry, but he can put in his response here and now when he feels like. We've come to the end of this round table. I think it's been a great debate. I do think that we've got so much more to learn and a great deal of distance to go. I'm trying to formulate an idea here, a template of giving people some more information and advice based on the stories that we share here on World Jam Global Radio and Issues Today in particular. I do hope that each and every one of you who've been tuning in today have been motivated, inspired and moved by the stories that we've heard. I want to thank my panel, Jerry Summers, Dee Martin, Patrick Lane, Scott Russian and Yolanda McNair for really their great contributions on today's show. And we look forward to being back with you next month, because this will be a monthly show now. With these guys sitting down, looking at reasonable cases and recent cases and talking about them in great detail to give us a better understanding of some of the things that we're facing. So I thank you all for taking part in the show again, guys. But we're right out of time.
Thank you, Kervin.
No, thank you. Thank you very much. And
Thank you, Kervin.
And guys, are we all ready for next month?
Absolutely.
Okay, we're going to do this. Yeah, okay, fantastic. We'll do this all again next month. Thank you all for joining us. We'll see you again then.
Thank you.
God bless. Bye-bye.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks.
Already did my time. I paid for my crime. Already did my time. I paid for my crime. Already did my time.
Oh, I just want to thank my guests once again, Scott Russian, Jerry Summers, Patrick Lane, Dee Martin, and Yolanda McNair for an absolutely enthralling show. If you've enjoyed it, please put your comments and your remarks down, and we look forward to the next roundtable next month in June. Keep an eye out for the dates.
It was do or die. I had too many rivals. I was too young and foolish to stay in school. I learned my lessons in the streets. There was not a man I couldn't beat. I was good with my hands and very quick on my feet. I was swimming in women. I had girls all over the street. I was getting money. Life was so sweet. Now things have changed. The whole game has been rearranged. I'm a changed man. Don't need no gun in my hand. It ain't about being no gangster. Life is too short to spend it all in jail. Trying to cope with this living hell. Already did my time.
Thank you, Jerry Summers. We look forward to you next month, mate.
Already did my time. I paid for my crime. Already did my time. I paid for my crime. Already did my time. I paid for my crime.